Okay. So warm up, no homework, right? So we'll just go to the warm up. We'll do chapter 5, use Excel a little bit, work through some practice problems if we have time, then do probability, the rules of probability, and the lab activities associated with that. The warm up. So several times a week, you walk to a local park. One day you start to notice that the weather seems to impact the type and number of birds present. For 3 days, you collect data on the abundance of 3 species: sparrows, crows, and bluebirds. So go ahead and open the warm-up tab in the Excel workbook for Lab 3 that you've hopefully already downloaded, and make a data display for the provided data. That we had cold and hot weather, and we had 3 types of birds: sparrow, crow, and bluebird, and then observations for the number of birds seen for hot and cold weather. So somebody can just unmute themselves and shout out or type in the chat, whatever works. What type of data do we have here? Are the data ranked? Are they continuous? Are they discrete? Are they numbers? Are they words? Anything? Nominal, yes. So there are nominal groups, right? We have words, right? We have bird, and then we have weather. So we have 2 categorical groups. Yeah, it is discrete count data, right? Because we can't have seen 28.5 birds, 28.5 sparrows on a single day, right? We have whole numbers. They are discrete because they are not continuous. We can't have infinite net values between 15 and 16. So yeah, we have nominal or categorical and discrete data. We have 2 explanatory categories for the number of birds we've seen. Okay, good. So the first thing, if we're trying to create a figure for this, is we have to calculate the means. And we do that with the average function for each group. So those are the average. Oh, actually, let's move these groups down and then drag that across. So those are the averages, the average number of birds seen for each weather condition. We next need to calculate the standard deviation, which we calculate with the STD, the standard deviation .s. In this case, we're going to use .s because this is a sample. It's not the entire population of sparrows, crows, and bluebirds. We're just looking at a sample of them. And then finally, we need to calculate the standard error. There isn't a function for the standard error. Remember, we have to actually type in an equation. The standard error is the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size, which in this case is 3. So now that we have all of these statistics, these metrics, we can make our table. So we insert, oh, here, let me actually select the data first. We're going to use this data up here. is cold versus bird species, and the means is what we want to plot. And we get something like this. We can change the title to bird abundance by temperature. We can also add axis labels. See, mean abundance and bird species. So this is almost right, but we need to include standard error bars when our bar chart represents means. So remember, we need to add a chart element, error bars. Gosh, hold on. More options. First, we'll add for cold. Remember, we have to customize and then select our specific values. So, which is right here, these three values correspond to these three errors. And delete that. Do the same thing for those ones. And there we go. Now we have the right error bars for cold. We can do the same thing for the hot weather. So making sure we select the standard errors for hot weather. And there we go. So we've got the average abundance of each bird type and standard error bars, the correct standard error bars that we calculated over here corresponding to each bar. So this is roughly the figure you should have created. Are there any questions about that or how I made that?
No question.
Okay. Okay. You can see the PowerPoint, right? I think.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so for chapter 5, descriptive stats, a lot of these should be pretty pretty familiar. So, and these are really useful for graphical depictions of data, right? So these include things like mean, standard deviation, standard error. And they give us an idea of what the data looks like. And there are 3 types. So we have location, dispersion, and shape. Location stats tell us where on the number line the sample values are located. These include mid-range, which is the point midway between the largest and smallest variate. The mode, which is the most common variate. The median, which is the variate in the middle of the sample, or the mean of the middle 2 variates. The median also means that there is 50% of the data is below it and 50% of the data is above it. And then there's the mean, which is represented as X bar when we're talking about samples. And this is the mean of the sample. The equation for the mid-range is max plus the minimum divided by 2. So just the average between the maximum value and the minimum value. The equation for the mean, most of you should be aware of, is just the sum of all of the variance divided by the sample size, the total number of numbers used summed together. The quartiles are median, well, we have first quartile, second, which is the median, and third quartile. The median, again, is the second quartile, where 50% of the data is above and 50% is below. For the first quartile, Q1, 25% of the data is below and 75% is above. And for the third quartile, we have 75% of the data below and 25% above. So quartiles essentially just break the data set into 4 equal parts. And that doesn't mean that the range of those parts is equal, but it means that for the number of observations you have, they're split equally, right? So let's say you had 12 observations. That means that each quartile would contain 3 variates. Right, so for our third quartile, that would mean that 25%, 3 values are above it and 9 values are below it. The data has to be in numerical order if you're calculating by hand, or if you're using the equation in the, I think it's on page 28, that you used on the homework assignment 2 weeks ago. So you can either find the median of the lower or upper half of the data. That's one method, right? So if you find the median of the lower half, you find the first quartile. If you find the median of the upper half, you find the third quartile. Or you can use this equation, which you should all be familiar with, right, from the homework assignment in week 1. So it's the quartile, so 1 or 3, or 2, I suppose, times n+1 divided by 4. And that gives you the index of the quartile, not the actual quartile. So if we're looking for Q1 here, it'd be n+1 over 4. There are 11 indices. So 11 plus 1 divided by 4 equals 3. So the third index is our Q1, which in this case is 2. In this class, we're pretty much just going to be using the quartile function in Excel, which we'll go over in a little bit when we get to the Excel part. Next are the dispersion statistics, and these are used to measure the amount of variability among the variates. So the first one is the range, which is the maximum minus the minimum. It's just the difference, like how much space is there between the maximum value and the minimum value. There's the interquartile range, or IQR, which is Q3 minus Q1. And this tells us how much space there is between the middle 50% of the data. You can also find what the middle 50% of the data is by reporting Q1 and Q3. Those two numbers hold the middle 50% of data. I'm repeating that a lot because I'm going to ask you to solve for that. So remember, the middle 50% of data is located between Q1 and Q3. Variance, which in a sample is S squared, is calculated by comparing each of the observations to the sample mean and summing the squares of those differences. Standard deviation is the square root of the variance. And it's directly related to the mean dispersion of observations away from the sample mean. And it's what we use more commonly than variance. So variance measures the deviation from the variate to the mean. And there are 2 equations for this. The definition is here. We get the variate minus x bar squared and then summing each of those. This term, this numerator, is called the sum of squares. And you'll hear that a lot. We divide the sum of squares divided over, we divide the sum of squares by something called our degrees of freedom, which we'll discuss more in the future. But degrees of freedom, in most cases, is just your sample size, n minus 1. The calculator equation is this. If you're using a calculator, you'll type it in this way. I think it's a lot more complicated to try to solve things on a calculator using this equation. Truthfully, you don't really have to worry about this for lab. You may need it for the lecture, but in lab, I'm not going to test you on this, and you're not going to have to use it on a calculator. We're pretty much just going to be calculating variance using Excel and R. So you don't actually have to type out either of these equations, but it's definitely very important that you understand this equation and what's happening here. So I'm going to draw this out a little bit, right? So again, we're looking at the difference between each individual point and the mean. Squaring that, summing those together, and dividing by the degrees of freedom. So, and I think I should be able to do this. Okay, cool. Okay, so let's just kind of visualize this a little bit. So down here, we're just gonna have our sample. So we have, let's just say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 samples, okay? On our y-axis, we're gonna have those values. So let's just say you were sampling I guess we can go back to the warm-up. So let's just say that we're sampling the average number of crows that show up in a park, right? And on day 1, we find, let's just say 5. We find 5. On day 2, we find 6. Day 3, we find 4. Day 4, we find 6 again. Day 5, we find 7. So on and so forth, right? We've got this kind of random occurrence of just number of birds that we find on different days. And let's just say the average is around here, okay? So our average, or X bar. What our sum of squares is really looking at is just how much difference there is between each individual point and the mean. This distance. That's what we're calculating when we're doing x sub I minus x bar. Is we're literally calculating what that distance is. And then we're summing those together for each point. We're seeing what essentially is the average distance between each point and the mean. The reason we square it is because otherwise, if we just summed them all together, we would get 0. Because that's the definition of a mean, right? We'd have all of these negative values would equal out to 0, summing with the positive values. So to prevent us from just getting 0 as the sum, we square it so that all values are positive. Sum those together to see how much distance is there from the mean, how much variation is there from the mean, and then we divide that by our degrees of freedom, our sample size, essentially. We're saying, what is the average distance between each point and the mean? So that's where we get the equation for variation. There is a difference between population variance and sample variance. So our population variance is, well, in general, we use Greek letters for population statistics and Arabic letters for sample statistics. So we have sigma squared instead of s squared. And you see that instead of n minus 1, our degrees of freedom, we just have n. But that's just the big difference between these two. And you should be aware of that. Oh, and this is the mean. This is a population mean, mu, instead of x bar. Okay, so our standard deviation. So s squared can be kind of difficult to relate to because the units are squared, right? So to enable comparisons, we use something called the standard deviation, which is just the square root of the variance. And that puts us back into our original units, making it easier to relate to, making it easier to relate to the data. So smaller standard deviation indicates closer dispersion of variance away from the mean. So here we've got a dot plot with a standard deviation of 5, 10, and 20. When we have a low standard deviation, the data is clumped closer together, right? There's less variation. There's less deviation in the data. When our standard deviation is 10, we see greater deviation, greater variance in the data. And when it's 20, we have very, very dispersed data. Okay, so smaller standard deviation, smaller variance means less variation or deviation in the data. It means a tighter curve and more compressed data. So when we're talking about standard deviations and standard normal curves and things like that, we have this normal distribution. And a normal distribution just means this bell-shaped curve that's nice and symmetric. And what we find is when we have a normal distribution, that roughly 68% of the data is within one standard deviation of the mean, right? So the mean plus or minus one standard deviation comprises 68% of the data. The mean plus or minus two standard deviations comprises approximately 95% of the data. The mean plus or minus three standard deviations is comprised of 99% of the data. This is very, very, very important. You will need to know this. I will ask you questions about this. This will appear time and time and time and time again. Remember this. Know this. Okay. Are there any questions actually? I know that a lot of the shape statistics and things like that, mean, mode, whatever, those are all pretty well known, but I know that standard deviation, variance, stuff like that is newer and can get a bit more complicated. So before I continue into everything else, are there any specific questions about standard deviation and variance? Okay, I'm gonna continue then. All right, cool. Okay, so there's also something called a coefficient of variation, CV. And this is how we relate descriptive statistics to each other and to other data. So, and it's essentially the standard deviation as a percentage of a mean or as a proportion of the mean. And it's the standard deviation divided by the mean times 100%. And it allows us to compare different sets of data. So elephant weight versus mouse weight, right? If we're trying to say the standard deviation in mouse weight is 3 grams, and we're trying to compare that to the standard deviation in elephant weight, which may be, you know, hundreds of pounds, we can't really compare those, right? They're hugely different. But if we say, well, mouses only weigh, you know, like 10 grams, then 2 divided by 10, we got, you know, 20%. It's a 20% variation around the mean. We can now use that 20% to compare to how much variation there is in elephant weight. So that's the main purpose of the coefficient of variation, is it just changes the standard deviation into a proportion or a percentage of the mean. Okay, so next we have shape statistics. So the first one is skewness, which is G sub 1. And this is the degree to which the data differ from being symmetrically distributed around the sample mean. So the degree to which the data differ from being symmetrically distributed around the mean. If we have a negative skew, that means we have a long left tail. Our data is far skewed to the left side. If we have a positive skew, that means we have a long right tail. We have a long positive side. And this is the equation for skewness. It should look pretty familiar, right? Because it's actually very similar. It actually contains the equation for variance. Again, I'm not going to really have you calculate this using the equation. There's an equation in Excel that we will use, but this isn't, don't focus on this too much. I'm not super worried about skewness or kurtosis, which is the next slide. I'll ask you a couple questions about it, but it's not going to be a huge portion of anything I test you on. So just know that. So kurtosis measures the peakedness, the concentration of observations around the mean. And it's represented with G sub 2. So if we have something that is leptokurtic, that means we have a high concentration of observations around the mean, right? A high peakedness. If we have mesokurtic, it means it's somewhere in the middle, right? We do have a high concentration, but there's a little bit more spread. And then we have platykurtic. If something is platykurtic, it means that there's a low concentration around the mean, right? So there's a lot more variation, in general, just a flatter curve. Up here is the equation for kurtosis. Again, it should look very familiar because it has the equation for variance inside of it and is very similar to the equation for skewness. G sub 2. So if kurtosis is greater than 3, something is leptokurtic. If kurtosis is less than 3, it is platykurtic. There's also something called excess kurtosis, which just subtracts 3 from G2, from kurtosis. And so that means that if G2 is greater than 0, it's leptokurtic, and if it's less than 0, it's platykurtic. Excess kurtosis is actually more common, from what I've seen, than kurtosis. Excel has a curt function to calculate kurtosis that automatically calculates excess kurtosis. And I'll remind you of that later when we're doing this in Excel. But I'll say it again as well. The function in Excel for kurtosis automatically calculates excess kurtosis. And the reason for excess kurtosis and subtracting 3 from kurtosis is that 3 is the kurtosis of a standard normal distribution. Therefore, excess kurtosis just tells us how far a distribution varies from standard normal distribution. So as I mentioned, they're all variations of the same formula, right? So we have variance over here, S squared. We have G sub 1. yeah, which is skewness, and then we have kurtosis. And you can see that these are pretty much the same equation. So variance, we've got right here to the second power. Skewness is just the variance with the cubed power instead of the squared power divided by the standard deviation cubed. Kurtosis is the same thing, but to the fourth power with standard deviation to the fourth power as well. So all of these equations are based on how each individual point varies from the mean. And then a quick note on rounding values and significant figures. This is a little bit less important since we're not doing a lot of stuff by hand and you're not turning in physical homework assignments. But don't round intermediate calculations. Save them in a calculator, write them down. Again, not super relevant because we're doing this online, but you don't want to round intermediate values because you'll end up with rounding errors by the end and actually have very different numbers from what the correct numbers are. So just a reminder, for exams, quizzes, things like that, when I have you submit a Word document, which you don't really have to worry about right now, and you do have to type in digits, write down at least 3 digits after the decimal place. And I'll put that in the instructions for the quizzes and exams as well, but I'm just telling you now as well. So the behavior of stats, how does sample size impact sample statistics? We find that as the sample size increases, our minimum also decreases. Our maximum increases, the range increases as well, right? That makes sense. If our minimum is getting smaller, our maximum is getting bigger, the range between the two of them gets bigger. Mid-range, median, Q1, Q3, median, mean, variance, standard deviation, all of this should stay about the same. And the way to think about this is as your sample size increases, you're more likely to get extreme values, right? If I sample something 5 times, I'm probably going to get roughly the middle values, right? Let's say there's a population of 1,000 people and I'm sampling heights, right? If I only sample the first 5 people that I see, I'm probably going to get relatively average heights. If I sample the entire population of 1,000 people, I'm probably going to find some very, very tall people and very, very short people, right? Outliers. So outliers are extremely high or low values, and stats like mid-range, range, variance are highly influenced by outliers, right? Let's say, back to that height example, if I take a sample of 20 people and the average height is, let's say 68 inches, right? But I happen to catch a random person, or I sample one more person and they happen to be, you know, like 7'2" or something, right? That's really going to change mid-range, range, and the variance of my sample. The mean can also be highly influenced, but the median-based stats are much more robust, which is what I'm alluding to here in this meme. But median-based stats are much more robust to outliers than means. The mode is completely robust, right? Because it's just the most common number in your data set. There's also something called a weighted mean, which is the sum of each observed value multiplied by its frequency divided by the total number of observations. So I think this comes from page, let's see. I think this is on, yeah, this is the data from page 37. It's just like rolling a die a bunch of times. So we rolled essentially a 1 4 times, a 2 5 times, 3 3 times, 4 4 times, so on and so forth, right? And dividing that by the number of times we rolled the die to get the weighted mean. It doesn't honestly make a ton of sense to do it with a rolled die, but a weighted mean is something we're going to actually use a lot next week when we talk more about frequency tables, which we'll discuss a little bit today, but we'll really get into them next week when we do binomial and Poisson distributions. So I just wanted to get you kind of familiar with this now. When we have data tables, we have two-dimensional data, and a good example is a probability distribution or frequency tables. Again, we're going to be doing a lot of probability distributions and frequency tables next week. So, for example, if we roll a six-sided die, we expect to get each number 1/6 of the time, right? And we can use a frequency table to compare observed and expected proportions. So we have numbers 1 through 6, observed frequency, expected proportion, I should say, sorry. So we'd expect to get each number 1 through 6, 1/6 of the time. So if it's an unweighted equal die, right? A six-sided die. And we can see that this isn't exactly matching up with what we saw because there is just natural variation, right? And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But all these proportions should always, 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 always sum to 1. Right? Because 1 is just 100%, right? If we sum all possibilities, we should always get 1 or 100% of the possible outcomes. Okay, so we'll run through the new function or the descriptive statistics in Excel. Are there any questions before we move on to Excel?
No questions.
Okay. Great. All right, so your new functions tab is a little bit different from the ones we've had before, and everything is already filled out. I thought that would be a little bit easier for everyone. So these data are based on the data on page 36. So we've just got some data here. We've got the statistics we're solving for, calculations for them, and a little bit of an explanation about each of them. So for our mid-range, we've got our maximum value plus our minimum value divided by 2. And we're using the max and min function. So the max finds the maximum number out of the selected range of data. The minimum finds the minimum value from the selected range of data. We're adding them together, dividing by 2. We're finding the average or the midpoint between the smallest and largest numbers. It's not super commonly used, but just for completeness sake, we're going to go over it. We have the mean, which we should all be pretty familiar with now, so we use the average function. We have the median. Using the median function finds the middle number within the sequence. And then we have this quartile function. So we have this quartile function where we select the range of data, comma, and then either 1, 2, or 3, and it'll calculate the quartile for your first quartile, second, or third quartile. And again, this value is greater than 25% of the observations. 25% of the data is below this value. Same thing for Q3, except instead of a 1, we have 3 because we're looking at the third quartile now. We have the mode, which is just using the function mode for the selected data range. You'll see here that we get this NA, right? We have this weird error. There are no repeated numbers in this data set, and that's why we're getting this error. Excel is telling us there is no mode. For the range, we're just calculating the range with the maximum minus the minimum. The variance for this sample, we're using var.s for the selected data, right? So we don't have to type in the equation or anything like that. We're just using the var.s function. And again, the variance is the difference between the average of all of the variance of the data squared and divided by the degrees of freedom. Our standard deviation is the standard deviation .s, right, for our sample of the whole data. And it's just the square root of our variance. So we could find this number just as easily by doing the square root of this number. Our skew is using the function skew, right, with the whole set of data. We have a positive number here, which means we have a slight positive skew, a slight right skew. The tail on the right side is a little bit long. Here we have our kurtosis, which is using the kurt function for the data. And we have negative 0.792, which is negative, and we have a platy, which means that it's platykurtic, and there is a low concentration around the average. And again, just a reminder, Excel automatically calculates excess kurtosis. So this, if it was actual kurtosis, would be 3 point, or I guess not 3 point, but it'd be 3 more than this, right? This plus 3. But we've subtracted 3, or Excel has subtracted 3 automatically to give us excess kurtosis. We have our interquartile range, which is the difference between Q1 and Q3. So up here, we're just referring to these cells. We didn't type it out again. So we have Q3 minus Q1 to find the difference between them. And then finally, we have our coefficient of variation, which is our standard deviation divided by our mean times 100%. So this adjusts the standard deviation for the sample mean, and it's easier to compare across data sets. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and work through this with you and just kind of calculate everything again for you to see. And then you guys will work on some of them alone, or in your groups, I should say. So first, we're going to calculate our mid-range. So if you haven't already, go ahead and make sure that you can type into your own Excel sheet while also watching me do it, and we can do this all together. So first, we're going to calculate our mid-range, which again is our maximum plus our minimum divided by 2. So the average or the mean of our maximum value and our minimum value. When we do this, we want to first open up a parenthesis, do max, max of our data, close parenthesis, plus the minimum of the data set, close parenthesis, divided by 2. Right, and it's important that we have those external parentheses around the max plus the min, because otherwise we would just be getting max plus the min divided by 2, right? And I'll do that as well, so we can just see that that is indeed different. So the maximum plus the minimum, oops, divided by 2. All right, so very different numbers. Make sure to include parentheses when necessary for order of operations. Our mean is just calculated with the average function. Median uses the median function. Close parenthesis, enter. The mode uses the mode function. Close parenthesis, enter. For our interquartile range, that is the difference between Q3 and Q1. So quartile, oh yeah, so I wanted to mention this as well. There's a couple different quartile functions. So there's quartile.exe.inc, and then just regular quartile. We're going to use the regular quartile function. The .exe excludes, I believe it excludes the quartile values, includes the quartile values. I'm pretty sure that the quartile function also includes them, but we're just gonna stick to using this one. So we're gonna select the array, comma, 3 to calculate Q3 minus, oops, the first quartile. The range is just our maximum minus the minimum. So max, oops, minus the min, close parenthesis, enter. Variance is calculated with the var.s. Close parenthesis. Standard deviation is the stdev.s, right, for our sample. Close parenthesis, enter. All right, and for C, we'll calculate our skew, which is just skew. And select our data, close parenthesis, enter. We get a negative number, so we have a slight negative skew. So a little bit of a long left tail. For kurtosis, we do .curt and select our data. And we get slight positive kurtosis, which means that our data is leptokurtic, right? So it's a little bit closer, concentrated around the mean, but not by much, right? It's a really, really small number. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Not by much, and I've included this here for you to reference. So, sorry, I don't know if I mentioned, this is also on page 38. I guess it wasn't really that important because everything that I'm asking for is right here. But for D, E, and F, D is asking, so it's essentially asking what range would we expect 50% of the values to lie within? What range would you expect to find 50% of the values to lie within? The middle 50% of the data. The middle 50% of the data is between Q1 and Q3. Therefore, the range, the actual range, if we're trying to say from here to here, is Q1 and Q3. Does that make sense? So from Q1 to Q3, 50% of the data is between those two numbers. So when we report the range, we'll do so by including both of those numbers. We'll include the lower range and the upper range. So the lower range is Q1. The upper range is Q3. So we would expect to find 50% of the data, or we can say 50% of the data is between 3.9 and 4.125. For E, we're saying what range is 68% of the values. This is technically worded as if we measured 1,000 times instead of just 20 times. So essentially, if this was a normal distribution, what range would we expect to find 68% of the values to be between? Well, looking over here at this very important table, we see, you don't have to worry about this any shape. We're focusing on this bell curve, this normal distribution, that 68% of data falls within one standard deviation of the mean. The mean plus or minus one standard deviation gives us the range for 68% of data in a normal distribution. So the lower end of this range is the mean minus one standard deviation. Minus the standard deviation. The upper range, the upper limit to this range is the mean plus the standard deviation. So 68% of the data falls between 3.76 and 4.23. F is asking, what about the range for 95% of the data? Again, if we look at this table, we see that approximately 95% of the data is within two standard deviations of the mean. The mean plus or minus two standard deviations. So we've got the mean plus 2 times the standard deviation. All right, sorry, minus for the lower limit. Equals the mean plus 2 times the standard deviation. And there you go. Okay. Are there any questions about that?
No.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna, wait, I guess, right, sorry, last thing actually, I'll go through this frequency table. So for this frequency table, we have the number on a rolled die, a six-sided die, and the frequency of occurrence, so the observed frequency. Just a note, frequency refers to the actual count, the actual number of times we saw something. Proportion is the proportion of times, right? So it's less than one. All of these proportions should be less than one. Frequency should be a whole number. Okay, so first off, let's just find the total. So the sum of these observed frequencies gives us the number of times we threw a die. So we threw a die 24 times. And this is the distribution of how many times we got each number. The observed proportion, P sub I, is equal to the observed frequency divided by the total number of times we threw a die, right? So we observed a 1 4 out of 24 times. We can just grab that bottom corner and drag down to calculate the rest. But wait, it doesn't really work. So why isn't this working? Again, so this is moving in a spatial way. So it's trying to now divide this number by the number below 24, right? It moved each cell down by 1. We don't want that to happen. So up here, to kind of prevent that, before we drag down, we can anchor this cell with the dollar signs. So now B9 will not change. I can click this and drag down now, and it works just fine because we're dividing each of these numbers by 24. 24 hasn't changed, just the numerator. So that is our observed proportion of each number on the die. Our expected proportion is how often we would expect to find each number, right? On an even six-sided die, we would expect to get each number 1/6 of the times. So we should have gotten each number 0.16666 repeating times. We can already see that we got some variation here, a couple of them. We did get the expected number of times, but other ones, there's a little bit more variation. Okay, so I'm going to put you back in your breakout groups to work on page 38, question 2, and page 39, question 3. Page 39, question 3, we changed it a little bit. As you'll notice when you look at the question, instead of it just being a random jumble of numbers, we kind of made it back into a frequency table. So you don't have to do A, but do fill out the rest of this. And yeah, go ahead and calculate the weighted mean. The weighted mean, remember, is here. I think I just write it on here. The sum of each value times its frequency divided by the sample size. So that will be this value times this value summed together. Actually, let me just show you a really useful function for that. So xi times fi. That's the first part of what you want to calculate, right? Or actually, sorry, I'm trying to just think of a good way to do this. There's a function called sum product that I really like to use. And it's sum product. And what it does is it finds exactly what the weighted mean is asking for. So you select two arrays is how it works. So you select the first array comma, a second array. And what this does is it pairs these up. It'll do 1 times 4, 2 times 5, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, and it'll sum those products. So 1 times 4 plus 2 times 5 plus 3 times 3, so on and so forth, right? So that gives us the numerator for calculating our weighted average. Xi times equal to that. And then our weighted mean is equal to that divided by the total. So you could, there's a couple of different ways you could go about this. You could do them individually, right? So you could actually do the calculations, but I find the sum product function is really, really helpful in making that a little bit easier to do. Okay, so I'm gonna break you up into your groups to work on group activity 1. We'll do that for about 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. I'll check in on all the groups and see how you're doing and maybe add some more time if I think you need it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How did you get the weighted mean?
So the weighted mean is, as I wrote here, the sum of the product between your frequency and the observation, right? And the frequency. So it's these numbers, it's these two columns. You're essentially doing 1 times 0 plus 2 times 1 plus 3 times 2 plus 4 times 8. You're summing the products of these numbers and then dividing that by the sample size.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's written out on page 37.
Okay.
But using the sum product function to get this value is very fast. So it's the max plus the min divided by 2. And remember, you got to include those extra parentheses around the numerator so that you're not just dividing the minimum by 2. The mean is the average, or using the average function, I should say. Median uses the median function. And remember, all of these functions are on the new functions page. Oops, not much. Just mode. There is no mode, which is why we're getting this NA. The interquartile range is equal to quartile 3, Q3 minus Q1. The range is the maximum minus the minimum. Variance is bar dot S, right? Because it's just a sample. And the standard deviation is the standard deviation dot S, again, because it is a sample. Skew is using the function skew. got a positive number, so we have a slight positive tail, a slight positive skew, so a long right tail. Our kurtosis, or excess kurtosis, really is negative, so we have platykurtic, which means it's less concentrated at the center and a little bit flatter. Same thing as in the example that we went over. D is looking for the middle 50% of the data. So the middle 50% is between Q1 and Q3. So the first number of that range is Q1. And the second, the upper range is Q3. The middle 68% of data for a normal distribution is between is within one standard deviation. So minus one standard deviation from the mean and mean plus one standard deviation. So the mean minus one standard deviation. And we've got the mean plus one standard deviation. %95 is within two standard deviations. So the mean minus two, oops, well, I guess it's operations wise, but so minus 2 times the standard deviation. Oops. That's fine. And the mean plus 2 times the standard deviation. Oh, that's what I thought. Sorry, that one is wrong. There we go. Over here, we first want to calculate the total using the sum function. So there were 33 total observations. So our sample size is 33. Our observed proportion is equal to the observed frequency, Fi, divided by our total. And remember, if we want to drag that down, it actually makes the most sense to just anchor the total so that we can do that easier. And I didn't include it here, but I should have. If we find the sum of these, they should also equal 1. Our proportion should always be 1 for both of these. Some people were having an issue where when they typed 1 divided by 8, right? And we're doing 1 divided by 8 because as an 8-sided die, we expect to get each side 1/8 of the time. It's an equal die, equal probability of getting whatever side. That when they did that, they got like January 8th. If you right click and then click on format cells, and then it should be already a general. If you change it to number and then click OK, you should get actual numbers. And these are all just 1/8. So we can just drag that down. And there you go. That would be the completed table. To then calculate the weighted mean, we would do the sum product of these two columns of xi and fi, right? Xi and fi, and then divide that by our total. And this is the weighted average for this data. Okay. So chapter 6 is probability. And this is where things can get a little bit complicated. So just stick with it, read through it, go slow. I know it's hard and complicated, but you can do it. Okay, so first off, probability provides the foundation for statistical inference, and it's used to construct models. So a trial is the sampling activity or experiment through which an observation is made and data are collected. An event is one possible outcome of an experiment. A compound event is a subset of the possible outcomes or events. And probability is the chance of one or more events occurring. So over here, I've got a picture of a northern anchovy. So let's say I go fishing and I'm trying to just see what kind of fish are out there, right? The single cast of my line is a trial. One possible event from that trial is that I catch an anchovy. A compound event for this example would be like I could catch an anchovy or a top smelt. And the probability is just the probability that I will catch whatever type of fish it is that I'm looking for. The sample space is the set of all possible outcomes to an experiment. So everything that can possibly happen. And a probability distribution is a list of the probabilities of the possible outcomes. And it's really, 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 really important to remember that the sum of all probabilities in a sample space must equal 1. So, right, going back to the die, we have 6 possible numbers that we could roll. The probability of rolling any one of them is 1/6. The total possible probability is 100%. There is no other option. I have to do one of these things. If this didn't add to 1, that would mean that I'm missing something. I'm missing a possibility. There's some specific notation for this. So P of A, that means the probability of outcome A. This symbol means not or complement of. I just think of it as not. So the probability of not A. So any outcome that is not A. The big U is or union. So in this example, we have the probability of A or B. This kind of like upside down U is and or intersection, and it's the probability, and this would be the probability of A and B happening. This bar, this vertical bar, and another probability on the other side is under the condition that X has already occurred. So the probability of A given B. That's a typical way to read it. I like to read it as what's the probability of A if B? Instead of probability of B given or A given B, but yeah. All right, so let's go through the rules of probability. So hopefully everybody is kind of familiar with cards. I'm going to be referring to decks of cards a lot, but if you're not, a quick review. There are 52 cards in a deck. There are 4 suits. There are spades, clubs, diamonds, and hearts. And there are 3 face cards. There are, so the cards are 2 through 10, Jack, Queen, King, and then Ace. Okay. So for simple probability, rule 1, if a trial has k equally likely outcomes, of which one and only one can happen in a single trial, the probability of any individual outcome is 1/k. And a perfect example of this is rolling a die or a pair of die. So the probability of A is the number of outcomes in group A divided by the total number of possible outcomes. So what's the probability of getting an even number in a single throw of a fair 6-sided die? Somebody can just shout this out, or you can type this into the chat, but I'm actually asking you guys to answer these things. So what's the probability of getting an even number in the throw of a single fair six-sided die?
50%.
50%, exactly, right? Half of the numbers on a six-sided die are even, half of them are odd. So 3 out of 6 are even, 50%. What's the probability of getting an ace out of a shuffled deck of 52 cards? 4 out of 52, yes, exactly. There are 4 aces and 52 cards. What's the probability of not getting an ace? 48 out of 52, right? So the remaining 48 cards are not aces, which means 48 out of 52 is our probability. So good job. I feel this is I feel like definitely the rule that we're most familiar with. But nice job. So rule 2 is total probability. The sum of the probabilities of all mutually exclusive possible outcomes equals 1. So again, if we're using a die, the probability of rolling a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 equals 1, right? It's 1/6 for each of these. Total together, we get 1. 100% of the possible outcomes are represented in these possibilities. Rule 3 is probability complements. And we already kind of went over this one, right, when we did the simple probability. In the example of what's the probability of not getting an ace, right? It's just the probability of 1 minus getting an ace. So there are only 2 possible outcomes, really, when it comes down to it, A and not A. And we find that the probability of A plus the probability of not A equals 1. Right? Something happens or it doesn't. Those are the only 2 options. If there are actually more than 2 outcomes to an event, right, then the probability of A is equal to 1 minus the sum of the other probabilities, and the complement of A, not A, is equal to the sum of the other probabilities. So in the example of the 6-sided die, right, there are 6 possible sides that we can roll. But if we want a 1, we can really only roll a 1 or not roll a 1, even though not rolling a 1 means that we rolled a 2 through a 6. So the probability of not rolling 1 is the probability of rolling a 2 through a 6. And this is really, really, really useful sometimes when the probability of finding A is difficult, but it's actually really easy to find the probability of not A. And this is kind of a very conceptual thing to say, but we'll see in some problems and examples that we'll work through and things on your homework assignment that this is a super useful trick to use sometimes, and it can save you from doing a lot of unnecessary math. When we're doing probability, it's really important for us to also understand independence versus dependence. So independent, that means that the event is not influenced by the outcome of a previous event. Dependent means that the probability of an event occurring changes depending on the previous event. And if things are mutually exclusive, it means that if one event happens, the other cannot happen. So an example of an independent event is rolling a 2 does not make it any less likely that I'm going to roll another 2, right? It's still a 1/6 chance both times for both trials. An example of dependent is if I pull an ace from a deck of 52 cards and I don't put it back, I keep holding onto my ace, that does reduce my chances of getting a second ace, right? We went from 4 out of 52 to 3 out of 51. We have reduced the number or the chance, the probability of getting a second ace. An example of mutually exclusive, when we're rolling a die a single time for a single trial, I can roll either a 4 or a 6. I can't roll them both, right? Either one happens or the other happens. Rule 4 is the additive rule of probability. If events are mutually exclusive, so the probability of A or B is equal to the probability of A plus the probability of B. So in this example, we have the probability, we're asking what's the probability of drawing an ace or a king. That is equal to the probability of drawing an ace plus the probability of drawing a king. So what is the probability of an ace or a king? Yeah, 8 out of 52, right? There are 4 aces, there are 4 kings, there are 52 cards total. So we have the probability of an ace, 4 out of 52, plus the probability of drawing a king, 4 out of 52. The total probability is 8 out of 52. If events are not mutually exclusive, then we actually have to do the probability of A plus the probability of B minus the probability of A and B both occurring. So if we're looking at what's the probability of getting an ace or a heart, we have the probability of ace plus the probability of a heart minus the probability of getting an ace and a heart. And this can be a little bit trickier to understand. But we subtract the probability of A and B because we've already accounted for it once. There's a graphical depiction of this on page 45 that I recommend you take a look at. But here, I'll go over it in words also. So there are 4 aces, right? There is spades, clubs, diamonds, and hearts. Those account for the 4 aces. There are 13 hearts. We have 2 through 10, jack, queen, king, and ace, right? That's 13 out of 52 hearts in the deck. In both of those probabilities, we are accounting for the ace of hearts. Because of this, we need to subtract the probability of ace of heart once so that we're not double counting it. Does that make sense? So in the probability of an ace, yeah, and good job. Yeah, 16 out of 52. So in the probability of getting an ace, we find, wait, is that, hold on. Probability, yeah, 16 out of 52, yeah. So we have the probability of an ace is 4 out of 52, probability of a heart is 13 out of 52, minus ace and heart, which is a single card, the ace of hearts. And we get 16 out of 52 is our probability. Rule 5 is the multiplicative rule of probability. So if the trials are independent or there are multiple events in a trial, the probability of the trials is the probability of A and B, probability of A times the probability of event B. So, for example, what's the probability of drawing a single card from a deck that is both a spade and a 10? Well, if we do this mathematically using this multiplicative rule of probability, we find that we have 4 10s in the deck, right? We have 1 for each suit, and we have 13 out of 52 spades, right? A quarter of the deck is spades. So 1/13 times 1/4 is 1/52. So we also know, if you're familiar with a deck of cards, right, there's only 1 10 of spades. So this checks out. We know that the probability of getting the 10 of spades is 1 in 52. There's only 1 out of the 52 cards. But mathematically, we can also show that using the multiplicative rule of probability. This rule can also be used to test for independence. If you know what the probability of A and B is, if you're given it, if I give you the probability of A and B, and it does not equal the probability of A times B, then you know that A and B are not independent. A and B are dependent or mutually exclusive. So for example, what's the probability of drawing a single card that is both red and a spade? Well, if we do this, if we test this and use the multiplicative rule of probability, half of the deck is red, right? Because of the hearts and the diamonds. We, as I said before, a quarter of the deck is spades. So the probability of A and B should be 1/8. We should have a 1/8 chance of getting a red spade. But that's not possible. There are no red spades in a deck of cards. So the actual probability is 0. Because the probability of A and B does not actually equal the probability of A times the probability of B, we know that these events are either dependent or mutually exclusive. And lastly, we have rule 6, which is conditional probability. And this states that the probability of event A occurring, given that the event B has already occurred, is the probability of A given B, or A if B. And it's equal to the probability of A and B divided by the probability of B. This one can be a little bit tricky, so I'm gonna really go in depth about how I think about this. So there are two possibilities with this, right? So if A and B are independent, you'll see that it doesn't matter. So what's the probability that you draw a face card given that it is a spade? So let A equal a face card, so the probability of drawing a king, queen, or jack, and B equal the probability of drawing a spade. So the probability of getting a face card in a deck of 52 cards is 12 out of 52. The probability of getting a spade is 13 out of 52. So using this equation, probability of A given B is equal to probability of A and B divided by the probability of B, we find that B cancels out, right? And then we just get whatever the probability of getting a face card is, because A and B are independent events. It doesn't matter if I've already drawn a spade. That doesn't give me any more information about how likely it is that it's a face card. And here's just a kind of graphical depiction of that, like a flow chart. So for a diamond and not a diamond, right? If we draw a diamond on the first card and put it back, that's very important. If we put it back, that doesn't change our probability of getting a diamond the second time, right? It'd be saying like, you know, what's the probability of drawing a diamond given you've drawn a diamond? It doesn't change. If you're putting the cards back, it doesn't matter. The conditional probability for dependent examples that I really like to draw from is on page 48 of your lab manual. I really recommend you go through all of these trees in a forest examples. But yeah. So essentially, a bird flies into the forest and lands on a random tree in the upland forest. What is the probability that it landed on a mountain maple? There are 100 mountain maple trees. Deciduous trees, including the mountain maple, are more abundant in upland. That's what's really key here. They are more abundant in upland. 75% are in upland, which means 75% of the mountain maples, 75 mountain maples, are in the upland. There are 3 other deciduous trees in the forest, and 30% of conifers, which there are 2 species, 100 each, are in the upland too. So 60 conifers are in the upland. This discrepancy between the abundance of mountain maples and deciduous trees and coniferous trees from upland to lowland is what makes this problem key. So here's just a little figure I made. So we've got 4 deciduous trees, 100 each. Mountain maple is one of them. We have 100 mountain maple trees. 75% of them are in upland, we're told. That means 75% of mountain maples are up here. 75 are up here, 25 are down here. 2 coniferous tree species, 100 each, 30% are in upland. So we have 60 total up here. The rest of them are down here. What is the probability that a bird lands on a mountain maple tree given it has landed in upland? 75% of the deciduous trees are up there, right? So that means that there are 400 deciduous trees total, 75% of which.
Let me put your phone number.
Hi, somebody, you have unmuted yourself. Please mute yourself again. Okay. All right. So 4 species, 400 total deciduous trees, 75% of which are in upland. That means there are 300 deciduous trees in the upland. 30% of coniferous trees are in upland, which means, so 2 species each, 100 each, 200 total coniferous trees, only 30% are in the upland, so there are 60 in the upland. That gives us 360 trees total in the upland area. Compared to the 600 trees total, right? 4 times 100, 2 times 100 added together. There are 600 total possible trees. But we've narrowed it down to the possibility of trees that a bird could have landed into to 360 because we know it landed in upland. So the probability that a bird lands in a mountain maple, given it is already in the upland area, is 75 divided by 360, right? There are 75 mountain maples out of 360 trees. Let's say I wasn't paying attention when I was watching this bird. I was just looking around. I saw a bird, I saw it like flying, and then I turn around and I don't pay attention and it just lands. I just know it landed somewhere. And I'm still asking, what's the probability that it landed in a mountain maple? Well, now I'm saying there's 100 mountain maple trees. I know that for some reason. I'm aware that there are 100 mountain maple trees in this forest. What's the probability a bird landed on one of those out of the 600 trees? Well, that would be 100 divided by 600, which is approximately 0.17. That's the approximate probability a bird would have landed on a mountain maple tree in general if I didn't know where it landed. Compared to what if I said, what's the probability that a bird lands on a mountain maple and in the upland? Not given, but and lands in the upland. Well, then I'm like 75% of the mountain maples are in upland. So that'd be 75 out of 600 trees, right? Because it's not given. It's just what's the probability that it landed on this one of the 75 trees that is a mountain maple in the upland habitat out of the 600 trees. The probability of that mountain maple and upland is 0.125. Now, back to the original problem. You watch this bird land in the upland habitat. That automatically eliminates the possibility of 240 other trees that it could have landed on. The probability is now 75 out of 360 trees, which increases the probability or the likelihood that this bird landed on a mountain maple to 0.2. So by eliminating the possibility of the bird landing in the lowland trees, the probability of landing on a mountain maple is much higher. I've got like a detailed breakdown of that in the notes for this slide. So if you're still confused by conditional probability, check that out. And also, like I said, I highly suggest you follow along with the worked examples beginning on page 47. Okay, when we're sampling with replacement, it means you're putting whatever you took out from your sample back into the original pot, right? So you are dealt one card at a time. After a card is dealt, it is placed back in the deck, meaning the trials are independent. What's the probability that you get two aces? You got an ace on the first trial and an ace on the second trial with replacement. Well, the probability of getting the first ace is 1 out of 13, right? So there's 4, it's really 4 out of 52 reduces to 1 out of 13. The card is then placed back in the deck, shuffled, and another card is dealt. The probability of getting a second ace is still 1 out of 13. The probability of getting A and B, right? The probability of ace 1 and ace 2, because they're independent, is 1 out of 13 times 1 out of 13. We get about 0.00592. If we did the same thing without replacement, without replacing the card back into the deck, so you are dealt 2 cards at once, right? What's the probability that both of them are aces? You check the first card. Your probability of getting an ace is a 1 out of 13 still. The card is not put back, right? You're still holding onto the card, which makes these 2 trials dependent. Or the second trial is dependent on the first trial. If the first card is an ace, that means there are only 3 aces left in the deck of 51 cards. Probability of getting a second ace is now 3 out of 51. So the probability of getting 2 aces without replacement is 1 over 13 times 3 out of 52, which is 4525. So a little bit worse. We have slightly less odds of getting 2 aces if we already have one. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do some Excel examples. Are there any questions about probability? I feel like it's kind of hard to grasp just from me telling you and talking to you about everything. I'm sure you'll probably have some more questions when we're going through it, but does anyone have any questions just to begin with?
Nope, should be okay.
Okay, great. So we will just go ahead with Excel. So it's kind of interesting, I guess, because when we're doing probability with Excel, we're not using any fancy functions or anything. We're just doing basic math. I really like and recommend that you use tables like this. It helps organize everything. Not all questions kind of are set up easily to use them. Not all questions need them. But in a lot of cases, you will find that making a table like this, if I don't provide one for you, is going to help you a lot with solving these problems. So the first one, I'll do the first one with you. It's on page 50, question 1. So we are told the probability, or A and B, are independent events. Independent events. That means that A can happen, B can happen, doesn't matter. A and B can happen. And the probability of one happening doesn't change the probability of the other. We're told the probability of A is 0.7. So I've got that up here. A equals 0.7. Probability of B is 0.8. And then we're asked, what are the probability of the following events, right? So first, I'm going to fill out this table to make answering these questions easier. So we're told the probability of A is 0.7. And I'm actually going to type this down here so that we can do actual equations and math and stuff with it, because I can't use the one up here very easily. Probability of B, I'm going to put over here. Oops. Not what I meant to type. Okay. They're independent events. Using the multiplicative rule of probability, or actually, rewind. First, using the rule of complements, knowing that either A or not A has to happen, and that those have to equal 1, because those are an entire sampling space, right? Either A happens or not A happens. That means the probability of not A is 0.3. And it's kind of redundant to have them up here, but I'm including them because it makes it a little bit easier, I guess. So same thing for B. We have 0.8. That means the probability of not A, or not B, I'm sorry, is 0.2. And I put that over here. Great. So now we have the probability of A, not A, B, and not B. Now we can fill in the center of this chart. And remember that given that A and B are independent events, A times B, given the multiplicative rule of probability, A times B should equal the probability of A and B. So that's the probability of A times the probability of B. We get the probability of A and B occurring is 0.56. So that's how this table is broken up, I guess I should say. So these middle boxes represent the intersection of these happening. So A and B, not A and B, A and not B, not A and not B would be right here. And using this multiplicative rule of probability, we can just multiply these all across because we know these are independent events. The probability of not A and not A and B occurring is the probability of B times the probability of not A. The probability of A and not B is equal to the probability of A times the probability of not B. The probability of not A and not B is equal to the probability of not A times the probability of not B. Another really important note are a couple. I'll go over a couple important notes here. The total of the sample space should always equal 1. So if I do the sum of these 4 possibilities, right? If there are 2 things, there's A and B, you can have A or B, A and B, whatever. That means that the probability of A and B, A and not B, B and not A and not B, those are all 4 possibilities that could happen. That's the total sampling space. The sum of those should always equal 1, which we see here. If you sum these in the middle here and it doesn't equal 1, these 4, right, excluding these 2, if it doesn't equal 1, something is wrong. Something is wrong and you're going to have to go back and check. Another important note is that this is equal to the sum of these across, right? If we're looking at the probability of A, that includes the probability of A and B and the probability of A and not B. Therefore, the probability of A and B plus the probability of A and not B should encompass the entire possible space, the entire probability of A occurring. So we find that this plus this equals this. 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 That should always be true. Even if the multiplicative rule doesn't apply because A and B are not independent and this times this does not equal this, these should always sum together to get this. You should always have these summing together and equaling up. Okay, so now that the table is filled in, we can answer A through F. So A, what is the probability of A and B? A and B. Because these are independent and using the multiplicative rule of probability again, we know that the probability of A and B is equal to the probability of A times the probability of B, which I've already solved in my table. So this is just equal to this, probability of A and the probability of B. B, what's the probability of A or B? i.e. A or B or both. We're including the probability or the possibility that both are occurring. This is a little bit more complicated. So this is the probability of A plus the probability of B, the additive rule of probability. So if these were dependent, that's where I would stop. I would say the probability of A plus the probability of B is the probability of A or B. But these are independent, which means A and B can occur together. Remember, this is just like the example of drawing an ace or a heart. It's not the probability of drawing an ace plus the probability of drawing a heart. It's the probability of drawing an ace plus the probability of drawing a heart minus the probability of them both happening because of the ace of hearts, right? If we don't subtract the probability of them both occurring for an independent example like this, we're double counting. We're double counting the probability from when they both occur. So that's what we need to remember to do here. And we can see already that that's probably what's going on because our probability is greater than 1. Our probability is greater than 1, which cannot happen. That should not happen. That should never happen. You should never have a probability or a percentage greater than 1 or 100%, right? Right now we have 150%. That doesn't make any sense. So we need to subtract the probability of A and B. And now we get the probability of A or B occurring is 0.94 or 94%. There's a 94% chance that A or B will happen, A or B or both. C is what's the probability of neither A nor B happening. We don't want either of those things to happen. And that's just the probability of not A times the probability of not B, which we already solved for, right? That's the probability of not A times the probability of not B. And that makes total sense, right? Between these two, we're accounting for our total sample space. Either A or B or both occur or neither of them happen, right? So these two sum together equals 1. That makes sense. This totally checks out. And this is actually a good example of when it might be easier to solve this using this. Instead of doing A plus B minus the probability of both, it might just be easier to say, well, what's the probability neither of them will happen? 0.06. Well, that means that this is equal to 1 minus the probability that both of them occur. So with probability, it really just matters how you, and it works, how for you in your brain, it works to work through these problems. There's many, many ways to come to the correct answer. So for D, we've got the probability of A, but not B. A, but not B. For independent events means that the probability of A times the probability of not B, which we already solved for again up in this table right here. E, probability of B, but not A. So probability of B, but not A. And F, the probability of A or B, but not both. A or B, but not both. So we want either A or B to happen, not both. So this is equal to the probability of A plus the probability of B minus 2 times the probability of A and B. For B, we were subtracting it once because we were saying, well, but A and B can both happen. And we've already accounted for it once. We've accounted for it both times in the probability of A and in the probability of B. So we're going to subtract one of them so we're not double counting. In F, in this example, we're saying we don't want to count A and B at all. Not in the probability of A, not in the probability of B. So we're going to subtract it 2 times so that we're not counting for it at all. The probability of A or B, but not both of them happening, is 0.38, a 38% chance that A or B, but not both happens. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put you in your groups to go ahead and solve the rest of these problems. As you can see here, it tells you what page and what number each of these are related to. In this one, I put the probability of A and B up here for you. These ones, it does not include it. You also don't need to type it up here. You can just type it down here. It's the same thing, right? So the probability of O would go here, probability of BR would go down here. It's not written here either, but these are just totals. And these totals are just really helpful for you to keep track that everything adds up the way it should, right? So look at this example. You want this to equal 1. You want these to equal 1. Infected, not infected should equal 1. Symptoms, not symptoms should equal 1. This over here should also equal 1. That should be the sum of all of these should equal 1. These two added together should equal 1. These two added together should equal 1. This box from every possible angle from here to here to here should equal 1. If for some reason it's not adding up by one of those methods to 1, you got to double check what's going on because something is wrong. Okay.